He was just a young waiter, working quietly in a busy restaurant, invisible to most who passed by his table. But on one ordinary afternoon, something extraordinary happened. A customer spoke in German, words he wasn't expected to understand. Yet the waiter's flawless response shocked the room. What came next wasn't just surprise, it was a test of dignity, of prejudice, and of humanity itself. Because someone else was watching, someone powerful, and what that billionaire decided to do would change everything. But was it admiration or something far deeper? Marcus had grown used to blending into the background. At just 24, he worked long shifts at an upscale restaurant where most customers barely looked at him twice. To them, he was just the waiter, polite, efficient, and forgettable. But what they didn't see was the young man behind the uniform, a college graduate, fluent in 3 languages, carrying dreams bigger than the walls of that dining room. Every day, Marcus walked past polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, serving meals to people whose wealth could buy more in a single night than he earned in a year. He kept his head down, moving with quiet discipline, knowing all too well that one wrong glance, one misunderstood action, could invite judgment. In a world that too often reduced him to the color of his skin, he had learned to tread carefully. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a spark, an intelligence and resilience that few ever noticed. It was there as he carried heavy trays, as he nodded through dismissive remarks, and as he silently endured the subtle reminders that he didn't quite belong. But life had taught him patience, and Marcus knew that sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrived in the most ordinary disguises. And on one seemingly routine afternoon, in the middle of another shift, that moment finally came. A stranger at one of his tables spoke words that carried the weight of a different world, a language Marcus wasn't expected to know. What happened next would not only reveal his hidden strength, but also expose the quiet prejudice lingering in the room and attract the attention of someone whose reaction no one could have predicted. The moment slipped in quietly, like a ripple across calm water. Marcus was clearing plates from a corner table when a middle-aged man in a tailored suit began speaking rapid German to his guest. The words were sharp, fast, and confident, meant for private conversation far from the ears of the staff. But to Marcus, each syllable was clear as day. Without hesitation, he answered back. His pronunciation was flawless, his tone precise. For a second, the room froze. The man's guest smiled in surprise, but the suited customer did not. Instead, his eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus with the kind of suspicion that was all too familiar. The air around the table shifted. What should have been admiration quickly twisted into something else. An unspoken question of how someone like him could possibly know such a language. The conversation grew louder, other patrons turning their heads. Marcus felt the weight of every stare. His heart raced, though he kept his posture steady. He had seen this before, achievement treated not as talent, but as anomaly, an exception that needed to be explained. The customer's tone dripped with condescension, as though Marcus's intelligence were something stolen rather than earned. And beneath it all was the sting of disbelief, sharpened by prejudice. Minutes stretched on like hours. Whispered comments floated from nearby tables, some impressed, others mocking. One woman chuckled under her breath, calling it cute. A man muttered that Marcus was probably showing off, trying to act smarter than he was. The more Marcus excelled, the smaller they tried to make him feel. Still, he refused to retreat. He continued to serve with quiet dignity, translating without hesitation, until the customer finally leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but his silence carried an edge Marcus could feel in his chest. When the man left, he tossed a bill onto the table. Not a tip, not a gesture of respect, but something tossed away like scraps. Marcus thought the moment was over. He returned to work, head down, his throat tight, but his composure intact. Yet across the room, another figure had been watching. A man whose presence carried weight, someone who blended in only because he chose to. The billionaire had witnessed everything: the arrogance, the prejudice, the quiet strength it took for Marcus to endure without breaking. He didn't move right away. He simply watched, studying the young waiter with a look that was not pity, but recognition. Something was forming, though Marcus had no idea. And then, as Marcus turned to clear another table, he noticed the man calling for the check. The moment seemed routine, almost ordinary. But tucked inside the folded bill was something unexpected, something that would shift the course of Marcus's life forever. What had begun as an afternoon of humiliation was about to become the beginning of a story Marcus never imagined he'd be part of. Marcus slid the folded check from the billionaire's table, expecting just another routine transaction. But as he opened it, his breath caught. Inside was not only a tip, but a handwritten note. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. "I saw everything. Don't let them define you." For a second, he didn't know how to react. His hands trembled, torn between gratitude and the lingering sting of humiliation. The memory of the earlier table still burned, those dismissive stares, that mocking tone, the whispered judgment that reduced him to nothing more than skin color in a room that refused to see his worth. But here, in front of him, was undeniable acknowledgement. A recognition not of pity, but of strength. It was validation from someone whose wealth and power commanded the room, yet chose to use that power not to belittle, but to uplift. Still, the moment wasn't free of tension. Other waiters noticed, curious eyes glancing at the folded paper in Marcus's hand. A manager hovered nearby, watching closely, as though afraid Marcus might suddenly overstep. The air thickened with silent questions. Why him? What did he do to deserve this? The weight of envy, suspicion, and unspoken bias pressed down harder than applause ever could. Marcus felt the duality of his reality, lifted by one man's respect, yet still caged by the system around him. It was the kind of moment that left him suspended between triumph and pain, unsure which would consume him first. And as he tucked the note into his pocket, heart pounding, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about a generous tip or kind words. It was a signal, a reminder that even in places designed to diminish him, his worth could not be erased. But what Marcus didn't yet realize was how this single act of recognition would ripple beyond that dining room, changing not only his future, but the way others would see him forever. When Marcus walked out of the restaurant that night, the folded note was still pressed against his chest like a shield. The tip was generous, far more than he had ever received, but it wasn't the money that stayed with him. It was the words, the recognition. For once, someone had seen him not as a stereotype, not as an invisible worker in the background, but as a man with dignity, talent, and worth. Yet even with that glimmer of validation, the scars of the day lingered. He couldn't erase the way the room had shifted against him, how whispers turned to judgment the moment he dared to show intelligence they didn't expect. That sting was a reminder that racism isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's hidden in looks, in tones, in the weight of disbelief when someone breaks the boxes they're forced into. Marcus carried both truths with him, the pain of prejudice and the power of recognition. That night reminded him, and everyone who would later hear his story, that a single act of respect can change a person's path. But it also reminded him of the bigger fight, that respect should never be the exception, and dignity should not depend on who happens to be watching. Because Marcus's story isn't just his own, it echoes the experiences of countless others whose voices go unheard, whose talents go unseen, and whose humanity is questioned simply because of the color of their skin. So the question remains, how many more stories like Marcus's must unfold before respect, equality, and dignity stop being rare moments and finally become the norm?